As Ukrainians have reported armed soldiers going door to door in occupied parts of the country to collect votes for self-styled referenda on joining Russia. Experts predict that the self-styled referenda will allow Russia to claim 4 occupied or partially occupied regions of Ukraine as their own. Also in today's discussion, meanwhile, China has accused the United States of sending very wrong, dangerous signals on Taiwan after the U.S. Secretary of State told his Chinese counterpart on Friday that the maintenance of peace and stability over Taiwan was vitally important. This is Alt 24 News special coverage. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm your host, Karim Faz-Zakari, and this is All 24 News special coverage. And before we bring in our guest, here is the latest. The territories occupied by Russian troops in Ukraine have begun referenda on Friday to join Russia. Ukraine and the UN condemned the holding of the popular consultation in the territory of Donbass on its accession to Russia.
History repeats itself. After Crimean referendum in 2014, the citizens of self-proclaimed Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic cast their ballots on Friday in historic referendums on joining Russia. Voting in the provinces of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, representing about 15% of Ukrainian territory, is due to run from Friday to Tuesday.
I came first of all because we've waited for this for 8 years. We are Russians and this is our victory. That is why it has to end somehow. This is really our victory. I came here and it felt like a victory day.
Thousands of Russians attended pro-government rallies on the Russian cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Local authorities in Moscow report that 15,000 showed up to support the referendums.
I am and I hope all Russians remember that our children, our boys are not just boys, they are sons of Russian warriors, a drop of their immortality and a spark of their fire. We want to be with them today.
In his nightly address on Friday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky condemned Russia's referendums, along with the mobilization Russia began this week, including in Crimea and other areas of Ukraine.
The world will react absolutely appropriately to the pseudo-referendums. They will be unequivocally condemned, and to the criminal mobilization which the occupiers are trying to conduct now in Crimea and other parts of Ukraine, which they are temporarily in control of.
The White House also responded, affirming that the United States is prepared to impose additional economic costs on Russia in conjunction with the U.S. allies if Moscow moves forward with Ukraine annexation.
We are prepared to impose additional swift and severe economic costs on Russia along with our allies and partners in response to these actions if they move forward with annexation. We stand with our partners around the world in rejecting whatever fabricated outcomes Russia announces.
President Vladimir Putin has indicated that Russia plans to reclaim the territories once the voting formalities are over and has threatened that Moscow is willing to defend its gains using all available means, including nuclear weapons.
All right, let's bring in our guests. We have via Skype Mr. Michael Springman, an attorney, author, political commentator, and a former diplomat from Washington, D.C., and Christophe Ruhl, a senior research scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University from UAE. Along here with me here in studio, Professor Hamoud Salhi. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Professor. And we delve directly into the discussion with the first question being targeted to you, Mr. Springman. Are you with this idea that says there is this existence of partial mobilization of some nearly 300,000 reservists that has to be some kind of an admission by Russia that this invasion of Ukraine was a badly run one and a mistake? if they are calling up that many people, the largest call up since the, let's say, Second World War?
Well, Vladimir Putin is calling up his reserves to show and demonstrate Americans and their puppet states in Europe that Russia is serious defending its territory, that it is serious about being threatened by NATO, which is now borders from the Baltic to the Balkans, and that Russia will not submit to rule from abroad. It will not submit to efforts by the American government, its culture, its history, its tradition, its economy, and its government. The States, as I've noted in my article on Substack, the 100 Years' War, first began Russia and the Soviet Union in July of 1918, when President Woodrow and 13,000
it's
soldiers
really hard.
to battle.
Sorry to cut your thought, Professor. It seems that we're having technical problem or connection problem. So let me redirect this question while waiting for the control room to call you back and enhance the connection. So, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, how do you see the call-up by Russia of 300,000 reservists to actually intervene in Ukraine? What is happening exactly, according to you?
Well, there are the issue of wars. From the reading of it and the reports that we have seen is that there is a bit of miscalculation. I don't think the Russians expected for the war to go this long. I don't think they thought that they would be in this position where they would be asking the reservists to come to to be part of this, what they call an intervention or a special military operation. From that perspective, it seems like a lack of prediction. The second thing is the logistics of it. It seems also, according to reports from the Western countries, that there are some heavy casualties that the Russians are trying to sort of look at this war and do what they're expected to do. And from that perspective, calling for this large number is perhaps looking at it from the perspective that they are reaching a final resolution and they want to sort of address it firmly and putting troops on the ground so the war is ending by what they see as victory and an end to the military operation. So from that perspective, there are so many things to take into account, but certainly it fits with the bigger strategy, the Russian strategy. They want to this, the military operation from a strategic perspective. They want to get strategic depth to protect their national interest. And do in a way, taking this next step fits with that goal. I mean, ensuring that those strategic goals are met.
Very nice indeed. And it seems that we have Mr. Springman back with us. You could resume your answer.
Sure. I've got to agree with Professor Salhi, but I would say that the United States has of the 300,000 reservists, because the United States has been at war with the Union and Russia since July 1918. The United States does not recognize 14,000 ethnic Russians in the Donbass after the government in the Ukraine was installed after the CIA-led coup of 20 with the CIA station chief in Kiev, who goes by the name of Straub, helping to orchestrate this. The United States wants to destroy, wants to ruin its economy, its political and territorial integrity. Russia will not survive as a sovereign state because the United States wants a unit and is deathly afraid of a multipolar world, which includes Russia and China and many other states. The American failed policy has destroyed the European economy, is destroying its own economy here in the United States. I would say that calling up the 300,000 reserve, 1% of Russia's reserves, is a clear indication that the Russians are serious. They repeatedly not to have NATO encroach on its borders, and now extends from the Baltic to the Balkans. The whole idea behind this is to weapons and American soldiers to train the Ukrainians to fight. And the Ukrainians are doing a bad job of it. They seem to have lost half their army. The Russians are now ready for a war, not with the Ukraine, but with the United States and its NATO puppets, who don't seem to have any clear idea what's happening as a result of turning off the gas supply to Europe, both of their foolish actions. I would say that Vladimir Putin is playing the long game, understands international politics, and the idiots in the American government who don't understand much of anything, but can seem to threaten nuclear war against Russia because the Russian it's American history to attack countries that lie down. You can look at what happened in Yugoslavia, what happened in Iraq, in Libya, and what happened in Syria, and what is happening in Iran. It's a long pattern of American attempts to destabilize countries that will not be so to American control.
Very nice indeed. And here, Dr. Hamoud Sahid, do you agree with our distinguished guest narrative or, let's say, analysis of the situation? And perhaps the next biggest talking point is the referenda that is taking place. Can we see this as the end of diplomacy between Ukraine and Russia?
I wonder if there was actually actual diplomacy or a diplomatic discussions or negotiation between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Because behind the scene, this is a war that is directed by strategic interest. And the two main players are the United States and the Russians. And from that perspective, a discussion with Ukraine was with the Russians hoping that the Ukrainian could actually take a decision that would benefit them and bring a solution to the peace, a peaceful resolution, or a compromise that would benefit them. And initially, as we all sort of predicted before these things, we always thought, or some critics thought, that the Ukraine has that magic formula to stop this war from happening. And what the time was, I understand the Russian strategic interest, that bringing NATO into Ukraine will be interpreted as a threat against the Russians. And that's the same thing what we say about the United States, having the Russians in Cuba, for example. That's a military, a strategic threat from the United States. The Ukrainian could have come out and said, let's work a deal. I do not want to be a member of the NATO, but at the same time, I want some guarantees from Russia so that I am at peace. So Ukraine has a key to resolving this, or had a key. At this point, I think they are marginalized. And the United States and the NATO countries, the other European countries, are using Ukraine, are using this war to also fit their the biggest goal, which is to weaken Russia and to end this war in ways that would be detrimental to Russia. So I don't see the end is in sight, but certainly the actions, the reserves, the referendum, all this pointed out that the Russians want to achieve a solution by establishing a state that would be internationally recognized and taking what they seem to argue, to believe, that is a Russian territory. So from that perspective, it is moving in that direction, but the war is long gone. I think the biggest date for us to look is the American elections in November. Because Joe Biden wants to see some kind of success that he could sell to the American voters, that my foreign policy is good, that I'm making, I stood against the Russians. If that solution, if the Russians and the Americans do not reach a solution to this conflict, by November, we are here for a long haul. And maybe that's the only time we have to look at. Would the Russian take this as an opportunity? Will the Americans take an opportunity? But certainly the effect of the Ukraine war has gone beyond just Russia and the United States. It's worldwide. And now how to sustain this is the key issues. Can the United States and the Europeans sustain spending more and more on this war? Or can the Russians, this latest move, help them establish their dominance or their what they claim as their territorial rights? And we will have to wait to see in the few weeks or so.
Very nice indeed. And we are joined by Professor Greg Simons, an associate professor and a researcher from Sweden. Professor, thank you for agreeing to be with us. And I go directly to the question, do you think that many people would want to join the Russian Federation? And can we deduce that this is the end? As I asked previously, Professor Hamoud Salhi, maybe you might agree with him, maybe not, the end of diplomacy and no more diplomatic efforts between Russia and Ukraine. And also in the same context, according to the US and West narrative, these referenda are taking place rather under the barrel of a gun. They can't be legitimate in any way, shape or form. Why even bother?
Well, I mean, you got a number of issues here, and one of them is, well, there has, as your previous speaker was saying, there has been no genuine diplomacy between Ukraine and Russia, because Ukraine is an object, it's not a subject of these events. And this is clearly obvious when the times when Zelensky actually looked close to coming to agreeing to a peace deal. He had Boris Johnson and different US officials, well, basically telling him not to make a deal. As has been noted, I mean, this is part of a bigger plan, and I mean, this is clearly written. In 2019, you had the Rand report, which clearly stated the different countries that the US was going to use to weaken and overstretch Russia geopolitically. I mean, Ukraine was one of them, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Syria. I mean, these are all the places where you're having these conflicts. So, I mean, that's the one issue, that Ukraine is a geopolitical shatterbelt. It's a weak territory which is contested by different powers. And I mean, I think that the people of Donbass, etc., will want to join the Russian Federation. And I mean, the reasons being how they're being treated the last 8 years by the authorities in Kiev. They've been shelled, etc., etc. And now you have when these territories are being retaken by Ukraine, you have these essentially death squads dealing summary justice to anyone which was perceived as collaborating without any legal framework, no trials or anything like that. So, of course, I mean, you're not going to want to join a country which has disowned you and has been attacking you for years. I would also say, well, I mean, at the barrel of a gun. I mean, they are at the barrel of a gun. They've got Ukraine has been shooting at them, and you can see what has been happening. As I just said now, I mean, you got these accusations and these assertions that everything's at the barrel of a gun, and whatever Russia does, that it's some kind of coercion. Yet, I mean, the United States is not a force for good in the world. It never has been. And what it's doing in Ukraine is absolutely, beyond the pale. I mean, this is not in the interests of Ukrainians. It's certainly not in the interests of Russians, and it's not in the interest of Europeans. And you can see also, I mean, if you want an indicator where this is going, as we noted, this is not only about Europe or Ukraine, Europe, etc., but they're trying exactly the same blueprint which they did before the war broke out on the 22nd of February, and they're trying that between China and Taiwan. It's pretty much a copy-paste. So, I mean, a lot of this...
Clear, understood, Professor Greg Simons. And here, let me bring in Mr. Michael Springman. Is there any kind of legitimacy that the Russians can point to in these referenda, according to you?
Yes, of course. The States, for example, has backed the referendum for Kosovo to split away in what used to be Yugoslavia. The United States and Israel supported the secession of the southern Sudan because it was oil rich and gold rich. Supported and still supports the invasion and occupation of the Zionists. So I think that the legitimacy is clearly in the Donbass region. They are mostly ethnic Russians. They are to be reabsorbed into the mother country, and that realize that they have been targeted by the Nazified Ukraine. They shelled them. They used a little, German howitzers.
Excuse me, Springman. There seems to be a problem with your internet connection. I'm going to have to ask the control room to call you again. And here, let me bring in Dr. Hamoud Salhi. It seems that the US and the West have run out of options, and there is nothing they can do, and the war still continues. Is that true?
That's one way of looking at it. But when you look at the series of sanctions, the assistance that has been provided to the Ukrainians, and that goes beyond the economic, military, the heavy toll on the refugees, and the perception that the support is seen worldwide as being a bit too biased, ethnocentric. In other words, the questions that raised today in several countries and globally is why the Afghans were not treated the same way, or why the Palestinians were not treated the same way. These are all difficult steps that the West has taken. And from that perspective, I think there has to be an end to this, and the end is clearly a political solution. And because either the Americans or neither the Americans or the European can continue doing imposing sanctions that obviously have had limitations. Now, at the same time, will the Russians see this as an opportunity to reach a solution, to provide a resolution that would make both sides sort of leave or have a happy face or saving face? Because there are certainly some implications how this ends. So to answer clearly your question is that it depends how the Europeans or the Americans are looking at this. From the face of it, there is no more else to do. More sanctions, but if sanctions have had limitation, how far can you go?
Yes, absolutely. And here, Professor Greg Simon, just to close out this chapter, how do you foresee the situation of the heavily Russian energy-dependent EU bloc, rocketing prices hitting businesses and consumers? They have all dramatized how hugely powerful a weapon energy is for Putin. A race to find badly needed green and nuclear alternatives has begun, but the outlooks aren't good for the EU bloc.
No, I mean, it's been utterly suicidal what the EU has been doing. They've been closing down nuclear plants, they've been closing down other plants which provide electricity, and they're ensuring that there is no possibility of meaningful energy supplies from Russia. And they blame Russia for it because they refuse to trade in rubles or other things which have been created by their sanctions. And so I think ultimately, especially when you've got these terrible so-called EU leaders, such as this Ursula von der Leyen, I mean, they're utterly incompetent and they are ideological. And the problem is when you have a side which is so deeply ideological living in this little echo chamber, I mean, common sense is hard to come by. I think what may eventually happen, people will get sick of this when it hurts them personally. It's not hurting European citizens personally yet, but I mean, the time will come when this does happen soon. And this is why, for example, we're having rumours about this introduction, what is effectively martial law in some areas, like Germany, where they the talks of having military patrolling the streets from October. So, I mean, this is a very dangerous spiral down. And this is all for the effort of supporting US geopolitics and maintaining the US unipolar order.
Very nice. Speaking of unipolar order, coming up next, the United States and China have one of the world's most important and complex bilateral relationships since 1949. The countries have experienced periods of both tension and cooperation over issues including trade, climate change, and Taiwan. Here's the latest. The two heads of diplomacies of China and the United States, Wang Yi and Antony Blinken, held a meeting in New York where the focus of the talks was Taiwan tension. Following that, a statement from the U.S. State Department spokesperson said Blinken stressed that preserving peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is critical to regional and global security and prosperity. China's foreign ministry, meanwhile, said the U.S. is sending a very wrong and dangerous signal on Taiwan, and that the more rampant the Taiwan independence activities are, the less likely a peaceful solution will be. So back to you, Mr. Springman. Russia is looking extremely isolated now and seems a junior power to China in comparison, yet it's making efforts with traditional allies, with China on top, and that somehow allowed it to cushion the sanctions and regional cooperation in the Shanghai Organization, as well as the Intercontinental Organization of the BRICS. How do you see the survival of Russia amidst the backfiring of the sanctions on the West and the division in the EU over further sanctions and capping energy prices?
Russia is very strong as a result of American and European failure with their sanctions. Russia has more smokestacks than the United States does. Its manufacturing facilities, for the most part, off to China and other parts of the world, so that the capitalists in this country can make bigger profits. Russia, like 90% of the world, does not go along with the American sanctions, go along with the American politics towards Russia, and does not go along with this in the United States, the galloping inflation, whereas the same thing's happening in Europe. There are short, and Russia seems to be doing very well. The ruble is strengthening. Your partner to China, they are equal in almost every way. I oppose the unipolar world, which the United States seeks to continue to impose, but which is failing. You've got the BRICS countries. You've got the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. You've got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They're all bringing countries that are outside the American empire and putting together a new way of doing things. And they are trading currencies among themselves. They're avoiding use of the dollar, and which will eventually, I think, cause the dollar to crash. Get the word and start and stop pricing oil in dollars. Major shift in American economy and economic policy.
Very Very nice indeed. And Dr. Hamoud Salhi, how is the U.S., like many observers and analysts are saying, hoping to counter China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific?
It's a very, very interesting question. And what the Russians' Ukrainian crisis did to the Chinese is it made the Chinese nervous about their own internal issues, namely the issue of Taiwan, the issue of Hong Kong. The Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, what he said in what he reported, Karim, earlier, is really more of a moderate statement, because what he's saying is that he's saying that a peaceful solution is very important. The Chinese are also looking at it from the perspective that visits by the Speaker of the House in Congress, Nancy Pelosi, to Taiwan was seen as a bad move, as an ill-advised policy. So the response in the clip you showed also pertains to that. What we've seen, therefore, is that this strategic concern that the Chinese have, and it is in this context that they have reached the Russians, the latest agreement at Shanghai, where they see that the region should have a peaceful solution. That is very significant. When it comes to trade economics, I think the Chinese are still on point on their plan, that they do economic ties, or they build economic ties with the recognition of the state international systems. They don't intervene in other states. They see this as a business economic deal, and they stay away when politics gets in the way. For example, despite what we think that the Russians and the Chinese are in this together, the Chinese have been very, very limited and have been very cautious in the statement they made. They have made statements only when it comes to issues that concern them first and foremost. Taiwan is a key point. When it comes to other issues, they have been very prudent, they have been very careful, because they want to stick to their big goals, which is economic, if you want, hegemony, economic dominance, economic interest. So from that perspective, in the Asian context, they have also built a strategic relationship with other countries, with Pakistan, even to the extent they have good relationship with India, with other places. And they see this as a context that needs to be resolved peacefully. They do want to push this further by revising and looking at the international economic system. Basically, when you're looking at the voting system and the WTO, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, even to the extent the United Nations Security Council. The Chinese have a plan that sees that the veto, for example, should not be, or the expansion of the United Nations Security Council should include other countries. They also see that the voting based on quotas, like in the WTO and the IMF, should be revised. So all of these issues are structural that the Chinese want to change. So they do see this as an opportunity to change the international system, but they are not willing to take the lead and confront the United States face to face. And that's, for example, explain why they are more vocal when it comes to issues of Taiwan and other issues related to that.
Very nice indeed. Thank you so much, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. And here, let me bring Professor Greg Simons. Any observer or watcher of the situation would notice that China's sharp focus is on worrying domestic issues. The COVID crisis has consumed most of the government's attention. The ensuing economic difficulties have reduced China's capability to continue its checkbook diplomacy as it did before the pandemic. These hardships are further complicated by the Russian war in Ukraine, in which China was dragged, albeit unwillingly, as Russia's ally to face the West's rage and hostility. Having said that, however, we do notice that China is far less constrained in the foreign policy arena with the recent activities in the BRICS and the Shanghai Organization, and less once it deals with its domestic issues. I mean, it's true that China's economy has been hurt by rising commodity costs, but it's a small price to pay for increased global dominance. How do you read it yourself? And what's expected from Biden's Asia engagement to align with allies and partners? And where is the EU in all of this?
Okay. China has and always will be a power that thinks in long term. It does not abide by these short or medium term policies of the West, for example. So I think they'll be more than willing to trade short-term inconveniences, if we want to put it this way, for long-term strategic gains. And certainly, I mean, if we look at it in these terms, China, I mean, the US is talking about, if we want to call it strategy, I'd call it more tactics. They're talking about each election cycle it's based on. I mean, China is talking about decades in thinking into the future. So, I mean, this is one of the big differences. And, I mean, yes, I mean, they have been creating and enhancing these institutional structures which are free from this Western-centric influence, and especially US influence. I mean, you mentioned Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, but also this de-dollarization of international trade. I mean, this is all part and parcel of it. And if we look at the US, I mean, well, I don't even count the EU. The European Union is not an independent actor. It is a vassal of US interests. So, I mean, they will do whatever the geostrategic interests of the US are. But the US, I mean, under Biden, I mean, well, generally speaking, in the 21st century, it's been a problem because they consider that they've won the Cold War so that they can do whatever they like without any consequences.
Very nice.
And of course, now the consequences are starting to tell. And I mean, the Ukraine war has revealed not how strong and united the US and the Western-centric world is, but how isolated and how myopic it is. It cannot see the wider world beyond its own echo chamber.
Very nice.
And I mean, they've been trying to force India and these other countries who do not play these Western self-destructive games.
Very nice. Let me bring Professor Michael Springman as a last question, since we're out of time. Actually, how do you foresee the China standing as a big strategic winner if the war, as seems likely, drags on? And what is the trajectory and future of U.S.-China relations?
Well, take them in reverse order. The future of U.S.-China relations is very bad. The United States built up Chinese economy with shipping jobs and manufacturing facilities there. And now the Americans are screaming that China is a dangerous enemy. It is a war-like monster out to conquer all its neighbors, when in fact it's the United States that is sending warships into Chinese territorial waters, sending the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the octogenarian Nancy Pelosi, to Taiwan to antagonize the mainland, which agrees with nationalist Taiwan that there's only one China. And somehow the Americans think there are more than one China, and they want to, again, try and destabilize the region, just as they've done with Europe, just as they've done with Southwest Asia, just as they've done with North Africa. So I would say that China is going to be a big winner in all of this, as will be Russia, because the Americans have overextended themselves all the way around the world, and they cannot keep up with this international global system of warfare and threats and hostilities toward countries it simply doesn't like its policies about.
Very nice indeed. Thank you so much, Mr. Michael Springman. Professor Greg Simons, thank you so much for your thorough analysis as well. And Dr. Hamoud Salhi, thank you indeed for all these thorough analysis. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. That's the end of our special coverage for today. Bye for now.